about the way out in the event of the unexpected happening. There's an exit onto the lane at the back through the door marked toilets, and you can go out through the door here on this side that you come in through. I'm going to send around attendance sheets as always, and be grateful if you fill them in, please. It should enable us to keep in contact with you. This morning we have a very interesting session, and our chair is Mary Cullen, who would be well known to those of you who attend the school regularly. Mary is a member of our committee, and I can confidently say a distinguished historian.
So our topic this morning asks us, how do we understand imperialism today in Ireland in the 21st century? Now, imperialism has generally been understood as the extension of one state's rule over other territories, involving cultural and economic domination and control. Now, one definition of all this, of what happens in imperialism, starting from Lenin's analysis and going on up to today, sees it as a particular expression of capitalism. As it developed from the second half of the 19th century on up to today, its basic characteristics from the beginning of free competition giving way to mergers and cartels, leading to monopolies and control of prices and world markets. And similar developments in banking and the merging of bank capital with industrial capital led to what's called finance capital and the export of capital in place of the actual export of commodities. And this enabled rich capitalist countries to export capital to poorer countries where profits were high, and of course with stipulations often that some of the loan was spent on purchases from the country of issue. Now, continuing developments up to today in transport and electronic communications in particular have led to today's increasingly globalised world with increased geographical reach of capitalism and the increased power for rich capitalist countries to dominate others without necessarily exercising territorial control. Now, what is the current situation we're going to be discussing of Ireland in relation to capitalism? Are we free from domination, free to control our own policies and development, or is that freedom limited? In Northern Ireland, is it the relationship to the United Kingdom that is the central issue in these questions? In the Republic of Ireland, is it the relationship to the EU? Now, with regard to the EU, and we have a number of people who know a lot about that here on the platform, what relation would we actually like to see? Are we happy with the status quo? Or is there a problem for us that we think the EU is controlled by supranational members, an elite of supranational members in their interests? Is the Eurozone a particular problem, where individual states do control their fiscal policy in taxation, public spending and social services, but they do not have the crucial control of monetary policy and the rate of interest and the exchange rate? In Scotland, in the referendum debates, the questions of monetary and fiscal control and membership of the EU are interacting, of course, in the arguments for and against leaving the United Kingdom. Then, for us in the Republic, is the solution reform of the EU to give more autonomy to component states? Or should we leave the Eurozone or leave the EU itself? And if we ask these questions and try to address them, does that raise for us the further question of what kind of society do we actually want in Ireland? And the implications of our answers to the questions about our relationship to the EU for Republican citizenship, and we are a republic, which sees individually free citizens cooperating together to create the common good. And in Ireland, I think most of us would agree that public discussion everywhere generally accepts capitalism as the only workable system. Some see it as the best organisation of society for the good of everybody, and they would argue that too much regulation, including capping income levels, that actually prevents the brightest and the best from coming into decision-making roles for the good of all. Others argue that capitalism would work very, very well if it was controlled, strictly regulated and controlled, and then it could produce the common good. Others again argue, no, that capitalism is not the answer, and argue that only a society organised on socialist principles can create the common good and give all citizens the possibility of fulfilled lives. Now, many questions arise, and we have a very good panel, I think, to tell us their answers to those, and then we can open it to discussion. And we have three speakers, and each of them will speak for 20 minutes or 25 maximum, and then we'll have time for discussion. Now, we're going to start with, we have three, in the order in which they are going to speak. First of all, we have Kevin McCarry here on my right, and Kevin is a member of the People's Movement, which is a movement, of course, which is a relativist critique of the EU and its democratic deficit or otherwise. And Kevin also was a very active and former organiser of the Northern Ireland Civil Rights Association. And then our second speaker, whom we've welcomed very much here today, is John Foster. And John is Emeritus Professor of Social Sciences in the West of Scotland University. And he's Secretary of the Scottish Campaign Against Eurofederalism, and he's the joint author of Red Papers in Scotland. So I think we look forward to very much to his views on this. And then our third speaker is Patricia McKenna. And Patricia is well known to all of you because she was a member of the European Parliament representing Dublin for the years from 1994 up to 2004. And Patricia is also a member, as Kevin is, of the People's Movement, and she's very much involved in broad EU critical movements. So now I will ask our first speaker, Kevin McCarry, to address us. Thank you.
Okay, I suppose the starting point would be that if you look at the situation in Ireland today, you would ask yourself the question, is it possible for a small country like Ireland to deal with more than one overwhelming problem at the same time? Because Ireland has two national democratic problems. Overcoming partition is one, and developing Ireland's economy on the basis of national independence is the other. So the interaction between those two problems means that the energy, attention and resources that each of these tasks requires pulls against each other. A solution to partition would enable people to concentrate on the EU dimension, but both issues are intertwined, as I said, at present. Advance at one makes possible advance in relation to another, but the reverse is equally true. Listen to the words of the late former Taoiseach Garret FitzGerald. He had set up the Council of the European Movement in the 1960s and was the epitome of the Euro-federalist. Over 14 years ago, he drew attention to the tension between the 26 counties EU policy and its EU policy and its Northern Ireland policy in light of the Belfast Agreement and closer north-south cooperation within the island. And I quote, "Ireland cannot on its own block the development of a core European federation, and to attempt to do so would make us a pariah among our partners. And if Britain were to seek to do so, for us to join with our neighbour in what would almost certainly be a futile attempt would not be in our long-term interest. We would have the invidious choice of remaining behind with what would certainly be an isolated UK, or else join the federal core, thus widening, possibly irretrievably, the gap between ourselves and the UK, including Northern Ireland. The former line of action would effectively involve abandoning any chance of participating in decisions that would affect our long-term future. For all key decisions would be taken by the core federation, from which we would be absent. The latter would put great difficulties on the Belfast Agreement, for Irish policy makes this a kind of nightmare scenario. For Irish policymakers, this is a kind of nightmare scenario, potentially a stark choice between our European and Northern Ireland policies. So Dr. FitzGerald's long-term support for pooling sovereignty in the EU Eurozone became, in the end, a kind of nightmare scenario, at least in relation to the North. And Fitzgerald's predictions became a reality when, in the autumn of 2011, British Chancellor Osborne, perhaps prompted by Washington, stated that the Eurozone should move towards a fiscal union with supranational control on budgets, taxes, and public spending in order to shore up the euro, but that the UK would not be joining it. This marked an important change in UK policy, which had sought since 1961 to be at the heart of the EU, sharing basic EU policy making with Germany and France. It meant that as the Irish state has become more and more caught up in the Eurozone fiscal vortex, and Northern Ireland remains within sterling, the political economic border on the island is progressively growing higher and higher. Because why should Northern nationalists or unionists either seek or welcome a united Ireland in circumstances when such a united Ireland would essentially mean substituting financial control by Germany for control by Britain? Northern Unionists supported Britain and the Allied powers in defeating Germany in World War II. They are not going to embrace the euro and a German-dominated Eurozone at this stage of the day. The alternative which Irish national democracy has traditionally offered Unionists is a central role in running an independent Irish state, not subordination to a German economic fiefdom in which most laws and policies are decided in Brussels or Frankfurt. Ireland had experience of an economic and monetary union before. In 1800, the population of the island of Ireland was 5 million, while that of Britain was 12.5 million, a ratio of 1 to 2.5. In 1900, Ireland's population was still 5 million, having increased to 8.5 million in the 1840s, at the time of the 1840s Great Famine, but then fallen back again by the century's end. But in 1900, Britain's population had grown to 40 million. The population ratio of 1 to 2.5 had become 1 to 8. And this sums up Ireland's historical experience of membership of an economic and monetary union with a country which was the most economically advanced anywhere at the time, the workshop of the world. And as to participating in decisions affecting our long-term future, Ireland is only one member out of 28 of the EU Commission, which is the body that has the monopoly of proposing all EU laws. The country has one minister out of 28 on the EU Council of Ministers, which makes laws on the basis of those Commission proposals. Most laws are adopted by qualified majority. And something which you hear very little about in the Irish media, as of the 1st of November, thanks to the Lisbon Treaty, EU lawmaking will be on a population basis in the EU, just in any state. And as Germany is the most populous EU state, this means that Germany's voting weight in making EU laws will rise from its current 8% of council votes to 16% on a population basis. 29 votes for each big state out of a total of 345, while Ireland will have 7 votes, which is less than 1%. Ireland has next to no veto on EU laws. This means that Irish citizens and the Irish government are continually bound by EU laws which we would never have adopted ourselves. And what about the democratic dimension, so-called, of the whole EU edifice? The European Parliament remains as more of a council than a parliament, with limited powers, and in those situations or those areas where it would have a capacity to call a halt to something, by and large it acts as a rubber stamp. And within that Parliament, Ireland only has 11 seats out of the 751 in the European Parliament. That is 1.5% of a say, and the North has 3 seats. So as a member of the Eurozone, Ireland has no control of either the Irish rate of interest or its currency, exchange rate, all of which are the classical economic tools of all sovereign governments to advance their people's interests. Furthermore, as a result of signing up to the self-imposed fetters such as the Fiscal Stability Treaty, we have given a legal basis to detailed control of our budgets by the EU Commission. Inside the Eurozone, it is Germany, the ECB, and Chancellor Merkel who decide what we must do. All this is clearly incompatible with the unfettered control of Irish destiny proclaimed in the Declaration of the Republic in 1916. Now, what about Northern Ireland? Northern Ireland is part of the EU through its incorporation within the United Kingdom. While it receives funding from the EU for various cross-border and community projects, it remains one of the poorest regions of the United Kingdom, and weekly reports come out to confirm this. It has the highest unemployment rate. Its impoverishment has been attributed to its remoteness from the market with which it is integrated, coupled with a lack of control over its own economy. In other words, Northern Ireland, viewed as a region, has as much a case for independence as Scotland or Wales or Ireland as a whole had before 1916. The 26 county experience has shown that the development of a national economy demands social control over the movement of capital, and while this is in conflict with the interests of the private owners of capital who prefer to maximising their dividends by exporting it. That was the 26 county experience. So fiscal autonomy is not enough, although in the case of Northern Ireland, both are incompatible with UK and EU membership. The Downing Street Declaration proclaimed that Britain had no longer a key strategic or economic interest in staying in Northern Ireland. Commentators link this stance to the end of the Cold War. There is no reason to believe that the new Cold War will alter that stance, because after all, British businesses, banks and supermarkets operate freely on both sides of the Irish border. Irish republicanism, in its broadest sense, stands for a genuinely united, independent Irish state, whose policies are decided democratically by the people of Ireland. It is important not to lose sight of the fact that national democracy is not just about undoing partition and bringing about a united Ireland, but about establishing real independence and undoing the conquest, in James Connolly's phrase. Ending partition is not an end in itself, it is a means to independence. And within independent borders, the Irish people should rule their own state, make the laws and decide policies for a united country, and determine freely its relation with other states and peoples. All powers and capacities that are either abolished totally or are significantly truncated by EU membership, both for the Irish and other nationalities affected. Irish unity is only valuable as the basis for Irish independence. It is hard to think of a single area of life, either in Northern Ireland or the Republic, that is unaffected by EU law. In the mid-80s, Delors, then President of the Brussels Commission, gave a speech in which he predicted that by the year 2000, the EU would be making 80% of the economic laws for its member states. In other words, the EU, not their own national parliaments, would be making most of the law for both Ireland and Britain. This meant in effect that Republicans were being anti-partitionist and unionists were being unionist over who was going to exercise the remaining 20%. One might argue about the percentages, and in fact it's probably still less than the 80%, but this was and is the reality. Inside the EU, the peoples of former imperial countries like Britain, France, Germany, Holland, Belgium, Spain and Portugal, which in the past ruled vast colonial territories, are discovering the drawbacks of losing their national democracy and having the laws made mostly by people they do not elect and who they cannot control. The EU thus turns the national question, the issue of national democracy, independence and self-determination, into a key political issue for countries that in the past drowned their colonies in blood and caused countless other people's national problems. Desmond Greaves used to speak of EU integration as tending towards the establishment of a European financial feudalism, consisting of a hierarchy of institutions free from the smallest vestiges of popular or democratic control. He used to say that the Bilderberg crowd and the Trilateral Commission constitutes themselves the government of the capitalist world. There is now a political terrain opening up resulting from Ireland and Britain's joint membership of the EU. Despite the talk of a future Conservative government holding a referendum on EU membership, the fact remains that British state policy remains within the framework of the EU. Can a politics be developed in the North that would take up the banner of national democracy and independence in the new form that is taking today because of the EU? There are some possibilities. The Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, TTIP, is a comprehensive free trade and investment treaty. It's, if you like, the epitome of what Greaves was talking about, this economic feudalism, that finance feudalism that the EU was becoming. It's a comprehensive free trade and investment treaty currently being negotiated in secret between the European Union and the United States. The aim is to rush through talks as swiftly as possible, with no details of entering the public domain, in the hope that they can be concluded before the peoples of Europe and the United States find out the true scale of the threat. Officials from both sides frankly acknowledged the primary aim of TTIP is not to stimulate trade through removing tariffs between the EU and the United States, as these are already at minimum level. The main goal of the negotiations is, by their own admission, to remove regulatory so-called barriers which restrict the potential profits to be made by transnational corporations on both sides of the Atlantic. The stakes, in other words, could not be higher. In addition to this deregulation agenda, TTIP also seeks to create new markets by opening up public services and government procurement contracts to competition from transnational corporations, threatening to introduce a further wave of privatisation in key sectors such as health and education. Most worrying of all, TTIP seeks to grant foreign investors a new right to sue sovereign governments in front of ad hoc arbitration tribunals for loss of profits resulting from public policy decisions. And that's not only loss of profits, but loss of potential profits. And the cases where this has been, these have operated, corporations have successfully won awards in the millions on this principle. The investor-state dispute settlement mechanism, that's what it's called, effectively elevates transnational capital to a status equivalent to the nation state itself, and threatens to undermine the most basic principles of democracy. TTIP is therefore correctly understood not as negotiation between two competing trading partners, but an attempt by transnational corporations to prise open and deregulate markets on both sides of the Atlantic. There is a growing body of concern among citizens in the EU countries and among American citizens at the threats posed by these negotiations. And civil society groups are now joining forces with a whole range of parliamentarians, academics and others to prevent pro-business government officials from signing away what are key social and environmental standards. Now, take us back to the north. Opposition to TTIP is growing across the EU. It is mainly led by trade unions, environmental and civil society organisations. And this isn't just another treaty. I mean, it's a fundamental development of a process which is anti-democratic, which puts transnational corporations in much stronger position in the world, and which takes away the very basic rights and standards. In Northern Ireland, the trade unions are particularly concerned about threats to the National Health Service. And here is almost a mirror of part of the campaign in Scotland, where in fact the threats to the NHS that came from the Tory, which was sort of perceived as coming from the Tory government in London, was part of the dynamic of Scottishness, the Scottish national identity, what they people wanted to assert. Similarly, trade unions in the north are finding when they do get out and do get a bit of coverage and are able to organise, that a similar sense is among people who see the NHS as a victory for a progressive thought and progressive policies, and something that has to be and should be defended. Unions such as Unite, which is both British and Irish based, are to the fore. Other unions such as NIPSA are mobilising against the privatisation of agenda. But opposition is not confined to trade unions. Chlorinated chicken is perhaps the best symbol of the hazards of TTIP. European consumers would face, if the transatlantic trade and investment deal is signed. Though the thought of eating chicken washed with chemicals we use in our bathrooms would prove disturbing to many, the negotiating process is shrouded in such secrecy that the hope is that that the deal will be done before people waken up to what is involved. The US poultry industry does not take steps to ensure that chickens do not get infected with pathogens during the various stages of rearing and slaughter, preferring to use chemicals to eliminate bacteria at the end of the production process. In other words, chemical washes aim to make up for the inadequate hygiene on farms and abattoirs. The European agriculture, on the other hand, has another strategy to fight meat-borne bacteria. The philosophy of the farm-to-fork approach is essentially based on the wise proverb, prevention is better than cure. The farm-to-fork approach requires a series of steps all along the production chain to ensure food sold to consumers ultimately is safe. So, in fact, somebody was telling me that in France, when they're doing a news report on TTIP, they have this chlorinated chicken up in the left corner of the screen, to just capture this. And I was thinking that the first demonstration the People's Movement will have, we should buy a load of those, you know, those rubber chickens that you can get, and stick them up on poles. Because, I mean, it just catches the thing. So, as I say, you have the trade union dimension, you have the consumer dimension as well, but probably the consumer dimension would strike home to people more strongly. And as I say, it is, this opposition to TTIP is one of those national democratic independence issues which transcends the border, and which something which we'd want to. Yeah, I'm just gonna 2 more minutes. Okay.
3 if you want.
Yeah. Okay. The 3 principles of Irish secular national democracy, of Irish secular nationhood, are, going back to Wolfe Tone, are democracy, sovereignty, and a union of all the people to achieve the first 2. Democracy means government by the people, and as members of the EU, our democratic rights are continually eroded. So therefore, that is a message that we need to get across, and has a resonance, as I say, both north and south of it, as indeed it has in Britain itself, in England, Scotland, wherever. The second one, insistence on sovereignty, is a natural right as well as a social duty. It's not an expression of national egotism or some sort of want to get over on other. It is absolutely essential to a state. And in relation to the third one, the subsuming the divisions or whatever, Catholic, Protestant and dissenter under the common name of Irish is the formula. The Irish national question is not about creating structures that perpetuate unionism, that create balances between unionism and nationalism, or in whatever. Although as a transition, Good Friday Agreement and so on are there, and it would not be in people's interest for them to collapse. But in the longer term, the issue from a national democratic point of view is developing over time a framework within which all can willingly play a creative part in building a sovereign, independent state, untainted by any sort of sectarianism or any whiff of religious triumphalism. Democrats everywhere who wish to advance the common good of the respective peoples need to oppose every step towards further EU integration, and to have as their objective the winning back the state powers their governing elites had robbed from them. This is now the guiding principle of progressive national and international politics for our time, whether in the north or the south of Ireland. Thank you.
For a very, very thoughtful analysis, which will give us a lot to think about, I think. And now our next speaker is going to be John Foster.
Well, I think most people sitting here would be intellectually and emotionally in favour of a yes vote in Scotland's referendum, which will take place on Thursday coming, as breaking up the union. In terms of what the white paper says, which is the mandate that the SNP government will take, I personally do not support that yes vote, nor does a significant part of the left in Scotland and the trade union movement. So we can hope for a lively debate at the end of whatever I've got to say. And I think what I've got to say has been made much easier by Mary Collins's introduction on the nature of imperialism today, using Lenin but taking it forward and emphasizing informal control by finance capital, even though that informal control is increasingly buttressed by state power institutions, of which the European Union is certainly one. I distributed the handout, which is the white paper produced by the Scottish Government at the end of last year, which represents the mandate it will seek from the yes vote. It is the Scottish Government's equivalent of the 1916 proclamation, which we've already heard about, but somewhat different in its terms. I want to say a little bit about it. I don't want to read it verbatim because it's very long. It's about 300 pages long. But I do want to say something about its content and about the timetable it prescribes, because that is also very important in terms of the negotiation of the terms of Scottish independence and its continuing character. Economic policy. The main driving force of economic policy for the new Scotland will be neoliberal. It will be a matter of reducing taxes on business and eliminating red tape and regulation. There is a pledge that corporation tax will always be kept 3% lower than that in England. Despite attempts by the Unite Union and by the STUC to get the SNP to take a position on TTIP, it has refused to make any comment. On the EU, the new Scotland will be an enthusiastic member of the European Union that will identify with its values. It will seek to endorse the completion of the internal market and the carrying through of the EU 2020 reform programme. On currency, Scotland will retain sterling as its currency. Edinburgh is, of course, the fifth largest financial centre in Europe, although it is subsidiary and all its money basically comes from the City of London. And the City of London, as you probably know, is not mainly British banks, but American. 2/3 of all the banks in the City of London are American, and they use it as a base for penetrating the European Union for their own purposes. But sterling will be the essential currency for the Edinburgh financial sector. Industrial relations. They should be based on social partnership. I think you've got lots of experience of social partnership here in Ireland in terms of the trade union movement. There will be a support for European works councils with employee, not trade union representation. And there is no mention of repealing Britain's fierce anti-trade union laws. In fact, despite, again, requests for clarification by the STUC, the Scottish Trade Union Congress, there has been no response by the Scottish Government. And in terms of foreign policy, Scotland will become a member of NATO as an essential body underpinning security cooperation. It does call for the removal of nuclear weapons from the Clyde down to England, but it has made no statement whatsoever against NATO's first strike nuclear policy. So that is the content of this document. And the timetable for implementation is very, very important indeed, and that is outlined at the bottom of the sheet. The referendum result will come on Friday. And immediately the Scottish Government will start negotiating membership of sterling, of NATO, and the EU. And its timetable is to have all that sorted out and agreed prior to March 2016, when formal independence will take place, before the first Scottish elections and before a Scottish Constitutional Convention, which will take place, the elections in May 2016, and the Constitutional Convention, which will draw up a written constitution, will take place sometime thereafter in the course of 2016. With a written constitution, and if you're a member of the European Union, there are obligations for new members, I understand, to write in the legal terms of the EU constitution into your own constitution. So, this is the nature of the process that is advocated by the SNP government, and which will be voted on Thursday. And that is why many on the left do not support that position. They support the traditional position of the left in Scotland, going back to Keir Hardie, and indeed back to Connolly, who was a member of the Independent Labour Party along with Keir Hardie, of a federal republic. That remains our position. Let's look at the international consequences of this vote. And the most critical question, will a yes vote break the power of Britain or England as an imperialist centre? I don't think it will at all. It might even strengthen it. Scotland is 8.5% of the population, 8.2% of the GDP. The main economic loss to England, and it would be a significant one at the current time, would be the loss of oil to the balance of payments. It's equivalent to about 3%. That is significant to an ailing imperial power with a very serious balance of payments deficit. So it would be significant. But that will reduce over the next 10 years to probably something less than 1%. And oil is a very strange commodity, North Sea oil. Its value is denominated in dollars, and it's entirely owned from outside Scotland. Mainly American, a third from the City of London, by Shell and BP. So, less than 1% of GDP by 2022. Tax revenue. Well, tax revenue currently is about £4 billion. It's equivalent to about 11% of Scottish tax income, but it's less than 1% of the United Kingdom's, and it will be less by the date of independence. And it will, in fact, leave a tax balance favourable to England. At the moment, there is a 10% per capita subsidy under the so-called Barnett formula to Scotland. That comes to less than the oil revenue from the oil companies. So in terms of public spending, England will benefit. Secondly, you've got the issue of the ownership of the Scottish economy. This is very largely via the City of London. It controls 80% of the retail trade, 80 to 90% of the financial sector, 90% of the manufacturing sector is externally owned, about half and half between the United States and the City of London. The drink industry, which is second most important in terms of Scotland's balance of payments after oil, is 80% externally owned, with Diageo being the biggest single of the companies based in the City of London. So ownership will continue in the hands of the City of London. And politically, what will happen? Currently there are 59 MPs. 41 are Labour, 11 Liberal Democrat, 6 SNP, and 1 Tory. The consequence of their withdrawal, and there will be a general election in Britain in May 2015. It might even be earlier, in fact, going by current circumstances. But certainly in March if there is an election in May 2015, and if a Labour government was elected, you can see the consequences of the withdrawal of the Labour MPs from Scotland in 2016. Almost certainly the government will fall and be replaced by a Tory government. And just to illustrate this point slightly more vividly, last year there was a very important vote in the British Parliament. It was a vote on whether or not to go to war against Syria, and the government was defeated. Had the Scottish Labour MPs not been present, it would have won, with horrific international consequences, because it would have empowered Obama to go forward. So, these are the consequences in Britain. And I think you could say, one I haven't mentioned, but it is very important. There would be, I wouldn't say it would be irrevocable or final, but it would certainly weaken the British trade union and labour movement and its ability to concentrate its power on where economic and state power is held, which is at that level of the British state, which will remain. Consequences for the EU. I'm not going to read a statement from Nicola Sturgeon, the Deputy Minister to the European Policy Centre, but it's very akin to that which we heard earlier from Garrett Fitzgerald about 16 years ago, about what a wonderful thing the European Union is, and they will be enthusiastic members of it. So they will be portrayed as the good Europeans, when if Kevin and others are victorious in Ireland, they'll be portrayed as very bad Europeans because they will be rocking the boat. But in terms of the balance of power, won't have much influence for the reasons that Kevin talked about, but they would be pro-US, like Britain. They would be part of that alliance because that is where the ownership of the industry is and of the finance sector. It's the highest concentration of US investment in Europe because of the oil, even bigger than in Ireland. NATO, it will be a committed member, and they parallel themselves to Denmark or Norway in their position, the Scandinavian wing of NATO. And I think Mr. Rasmussen, who's not in my book a peace lover, but somewhat aggressive, I think was previously Prime Minister in Denmark. I could go on and talk a little bit about Ireland. No, I wouldn't talk anything about Ireland, North and South, because I think that's something that you need to think about. But I'm not quite sure what the impact will be on unionists in the North. I think they would possibly become even more insecure than what they are at the moment in terms of the consequences, and they might be counterproductive. But I do want to just conclude, because I've probably gone on too long, two other points. Why this has come about, and the issue of the Scottish nation and imperialism. Why has it come about? There's one cause above all others. It has been the loss of confidence in class politics, in the power and influence of the working class, not just in Scotland, but across Britain over the last 10 or 15 years, and of the Labour Party as a vehicle. The dominance of neoliberalism within the Labour Party, as well as the weakening of the influence of the trade union movement because of anti-trade union laws and mass unemployment, have ensured that the current generation of young people do not see the trade union and labour movement as a force of progress. Or that's an exaggeration. Many don't. And across Britain, this last period, as in Ireland, has seen a heightening of exploitation and a loss of confidence as a result in class politics. And the SNP, in these circumstances, very cleverly, I could think of former Taoiseachs in this country like Bertie Ahern, very cleverly have sought to present themselves in a kind of social democratic patina. as being left of Labour. Although, of course, when you look at the policies, just read that white paper, that is not really so. And they have been successful enough in Scotland to shift the balance. I think Labour has probably kept about 2/3 of its voting base, and has shifted somewhat to the left, particularly in Scotland. But although they have captured a third, they are not a class party. They do not refer in any critical way to the nature of our system in Britain or Scotland as being a class system, as being capitalist or being imperialist. Those words do not occur in the white paper or in any of the speeches of the SNP. So this is, I think, the reason and why we stand where we are. We will see what the outcome is on Thursday. I think probably my own feeling is that for these reasons, and also because key newspapers are backing the SNP, particularly the Murdoch Press and the US-owned Glasgow Herald, that they probably will win. There's sections within the establishment and the banks that are obviously very worried about the consequences for themselves in immediate economic terms, and there has been some bullying organised by the British government. But nonetheless, I think the balance will be the yes vote. Finally, to conclude, I think we need to think rather as Connolly did about the circumstances of the birth and rebirth of historic nations. What kind of a nation would this new Scotland be? Just think of the parallel with Ireland, think of the parallel with the proclamation of 1916. Ireland was a colony. It had 6 centuries of struggle against exploitation and oppression. And an actual struggle in 1916 in which organised labour was the spearhead, in which Connolly's class politics were the driving force. That wasn't necessarily the case fully in 1919 and the period thereafter, but nonetheless, that struggle and the element within it from 1916 remained a key part of the national identity of Ireland, of neutrality, of anti-imperialism for a long period afterwards, whatever the neoliberals and external imperialism tried to do. Turn, however, to that white paper, the mandate the SNP will use. What will be the ruling ideology in what is a class society, very unequal, with a massive concentration of wealth, and with the key levers of power being exercised from outside? What kind of new nation will come into being? As against the nation that was represented and transformed in terms of its popular democratic ideology and identity as a result of the struggles in Scotland in the 19th century for democracy and for socialism, a struggle in which people like Keir Hardie and Willie Gallagher and Connolly played their part in identifying the key force of imperialism and the role of the Scottish ruling class, those who then and still now, through finance trusts and other things, owned and controlled Scotland and exploited it in the same way as the ruling class exploited England and Wales, and forged in that a positive identity and saw the way forward, as Engels did, as a federal republic. That is the alternative that is put today by the Red Paper group, which is led by the political officers of the 3 main unions in Scotland, and which will, when there is a yes vote on Friday, form the basis, I hope, of a fight back for class politics within Scotland. So that's the perspective I'm trying to bring to you. I think it's probably one that you maybe did not expect, but nonetheless it's one that we in Scotland will have to very carefully examine and think about over the next week. It may be it's going to be a no vote, and that will again demand a different agenda of redeveloping class politics. But class politics must be at the heart of it, whether or not it is yes or no. Thanks very much.
Thank you, John, for a very, very informative eye-opener, I think, for many of us to the issues, many of the issues that are there in the referendum in Scotland and the implications for both Scotland, for Britain and for perhaps many others. And now we come to our third speaker, Patricia McKenna. Patricia.
Yeah, thank you, Mary. Thank you, Mary, and thanks to John. I mean, just before I go on to say what I want to, I think it really was sort of an eye-opener to a certain extent. And one thing, just looking at the media coverage of this, I flick from one station to another every evening, and this kind of perspective really isn't exposed by the media. It just goes to show how badly we're let down over and over again by the media, who decide to play along the establishment lines and keep the agenda to what the establishment want the arguments to be about and the debate to be about. In relation to this section on imperialism, the Irish, the national question and Ireland, I mean, Mary's introduction was very useful in relation to what imperialism is about, and EU leaders, they rarely use the word empire. You know, 21st century Europeans want to forget about the word empire. They want to forget about this sordid past for a number of reasons, but I suppose in particular because they want to do business with many countries that were once exploited in the name of empire, and it would be completely counterproductive to, you know, bandy around this word that would basically be like a red flag to a bull. The EU wants to see itself as some sort of new way forward, a new future. But whether it likes to admit it or not, it has all the trappings of an empire. It is a supranational body with its own executive and legislature. It asserts primacy over all national laws and constitutional laws. EU law is supreme. You know, it makes trade deals, and Kevin touched on this as well in relation. It makes the trade deals for all the member states. It's now grouping its own very distinct and powerful diplomatic service. It mints its own currency for the Eurozone members and decides really, in effect, what our economic policy is. However, the word empire has been used, I mean, by our famous former Commissioner Barroso. He did let it slip, I think it was in 2007, where he talked about, you know, we're building an empire, and he said, but just with one distinction, I suppose, he said it would not have coercion by central diktat. Now, I'm not so sure about that. I think that looking at what's going on in Europe at the moment, I think we have coercion by central diktat. Now, you know, maybe if we look at how this new EU empire, European empire has come about, normally empires go through a various number of stages, and I suppose the EU, the European Union empire, has jumped to the first stage. You know, some people say, well, you know, people joined, or member states joined of their own free, it was a free decision of their own accord. But I suppose at the end of the day, it was basically self-interest why member states joined. They thought that, you know, somehow this was going to be of benefit to them. And when I say member states, I'm talking about the elite, the establishment. So it wasn't by gunpoint, okay? But and maybe the European Union jumped that first stage. But the second stage in an empire is the growing of the empire, and it has not jumped that stage, you know, where it has acquired new lands, resources, workers, etc. And then, of course, the third stage is maintaining that, and I think that's where empires always fall down. When you come to try and maintain the empire, you know, you have to defend your assets. The European Union is already moving to that stage. You know, the conquered people will always want the same rights as the conquerors, and you can see that already. So basically, the EU now needs to defend and maintain what it has. And the recent bailouts is a very good example of that. You know, how long will the EU be able to maintain this empire, and at what cost? I suppose one of the big problems with the way contemporary politics and looks at the situation is, you know, the contemporary focus has basically been on what we all know and see as US imperialism. And somehow the EU is not seen in that light. You know, EU expansion and its continuing, its continued use of neo-colonialist policies seems to be pushed to one side. They don't seem to compare the EU and the US in the same light. But the EU is being treated, and to a certain extent this is down to the political classes in all the member states and to the media and the establishment. The EU is treated as if it was somehow some sort of very humane alternative to the latest version of US capitalism. You know, and particularly the left parties have supported the EU as some sort of project that will be a counterbalance to US hegemony. But in actual fact, it's part and parcel of the same thing. There is a failure to consider the capitalist underpinnings of the EU, its imperialistic tendencies and practices, and its complicity, and we can see that at the moment in relation to US foreign policy. It is active and supportive of American military aggression worldwide. The EU backs and supports all US military aggression. So what is the difference? Why is this not being done? And that's a failure of left parties in relation to thinking that somehow the US is going to be an alternative, you know, a counterbalance. It's not. It's just another empire without the word empire attached. If you look at EU, if you say expansionism, it's rejected as a term. We talk about EU enlargement to the east. And this is a strategy, you know, where the ruling classes in both sides, both in the new member states and also in the Central Western Europe, you know, while they want to retain and hopefully increase the core status of the capitalist world, in their status within the capitalist world system. So they go along with the whole idea of expansion or enlargement, if you want to put it like that. And there's very little input from the citizens within those countries. If you look at all the countries that have joined the EU from the Eastern European in this so-called enlargement process, very few of the member states in those countries really had a real say in what was going on. And where they did have a referendum, they were basically either bullied or coerced into this new way that was presented to them. And indeed Ireland was used as a very good example of how this poor little economic basket case could be the wonderful economic success that Ireland was. And Irish politicians and Irish diplomats were marched in and out of all these countries to show and to argue for why those countries should join this imperial empire. And it used successfully until, of course, Ireland went belly up, and then there was no using of Ireland as an example as to why you should join the EU. Let's just forget about that, don't go there. One other aspect in relation to this is the military aspect of EU enlargement, which is it's really very badly publicised, and clearly it's a very important aspect. All the new member states from the East, the former Soviet countries, they're all joined NATO. So the EU and NATO expansion are part and parcel of the same project. And it's something that I think our own political establishment, our own media all seem to ignore. Now, Europe, it has to be remembered when we talk about imperialism and an empire, Europe could not exist without the plunder of resources from both the peripheral world and also it's internally from the peripheral countries. And the idea that Europe somehow achieved its wealth and its status of its own accord without exploiting countries all over the world is just impossible. It didn't happen that way. The countries in Europe that set up the EU were all former colonial powers, and they all amassed their wealth by exploiting and using imperialist policies to get the wealth that they had, and then to maintain that and to expand further. The economic, this was achieved by economic or military means in relation to the EU, and it will continue. And if you look at what's happening now at the moment, it isn't just in relation to economic or military means that can be used, but also there are other strategies which will ensure that workers throughout the European Union are divided, and workers worldwide are divided. You have things like, for example, Schengen, where you set up borders where you don't allow workers in unless you really want them, and you deny them the same rights. You split them, you make their options of being able to get the same rights as others very inaccessible. You have the whole, if you look at some of the workers' rights cases within the EU, this is in relation to how the EU drafts the policy. It decides it's all to do with the maintaining the union and the superiority of the EU at a global level. Workers' rights have been undermined on numerous occasions. The whole right to strike, other issues in relation to equal pay for equal work. Some of it will work only insofar as it will benefit big transnational corporations. So while the EU will say, oh well, we've done a huge amount for equal rights for workers, or equal pay for equal work, for example, for women, it all boiled down at the end of the day to a policy that had to be implemented to ensure that, for example, German company or French companies wouldn't be at a disadvantage if they didn't employ women and they had to compete with, say, Scandinavian countries, that they would all be on the same level. So it hadn't to do with actually women's rights or individual rights, it had to do with economic rights and economic interests. That's why all the companies wanted to be able to operate on the same level playing field, and it would be difficult for one air company, for example, who didn't employ or didn't pay women stewardesses the same as they paid men stewards. If, for example, another company did employ both and had to pay both the same amount of money, then they were at a disadvantage in relation to the company that could pay women less. So it was there was an economic strategy behind that. It wasn't actually to do with the rights of people. The same goes for all workers' rights. Everything underpinning all of the so-called wonderful policies of the EU there is another agenda there. But it's sold as something that the EU is interested in women's rights and workers' rights, etc. But when push comes to shove, as we've seen in a number of cases in relation to workers' rights, economic interests take priority, and the interests of the internal market take priority over workers' rights and rights that have been fought for over generations. The other thing I just wanted to mention was in relation to people will say, well, it's not imperialism. The European Union isn't an imperialist project. It isn't an empire. You know, people made the decision to join, or countries made the decision to join. When you look at the number of member states who actually had a say in joining the European Union, those that had referenda are outnumbered by those that didn't. In some countries where the referendums were held, they were very unfair. The questions put to the people were very unfair. The pressure coming from outside, the pressure coming from the establishment was completely unbalanced. When you come to furthering this so-called integration project, when you had referendums in some countries and they were few and far between, as we know from our own past, if we didn't give the right answer the first time, we had to vote again and again until we got it right. Other countries, and one of the biggest changes in the EU was the new EU constitution of the Lisbon Treaty. There was only one country in the whole of the EU that voted on that treaty, and that was Ireland. And of course we had to vote twice because we gave the wrong answer the first time. If you look at the new countries that have joined the euro from the former enlargement project, many of the countries, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, all these countries have joined without their people having a say. Opinion polls before the join show, well, Lithuania I think is just on the verge of joining, but opinion polls show that people want a say, that some people don't want to join, but yet they have absolutely no right to have a say in that. It has been foisted on them. It's a power, it's diktat, whether Barroso likes it or not. They're being dictated from above as to what their policy would be, or what their position would be, and what their best interests are. So they have no real say. When it comes to the EU, people will argue, well, it's not an imperialist project. You have a democratically elected parliament there. You have a parliament, but it's not the one who makes the power. It hasn't got the real power. It's a co-legislator. Yes, it has a certain amount of power, but a co-legislator is a bit of a joke at the end of the day, because when it comes to the democratic question, you can't hold them to account, because they can turn around and say, well, we tried to do what you want, but the other part of that, the council, didn't agree with it. So you have no way to hold them to account. You can't actually hold them to account. It's not an accountable parliament. When it comes to the Commission, and just last week, it beggars belief that this entity can be called a democracy. When you look at the appointed people who are now going to rule over Europe, the Commission has been, set up, and it has been presented to the peoples of Europe with a lot of publicity, but no real close examination of how these people ever ended up where they are. Our own Commissioner has a lot of question marks over whether he could even organise a budget here in this country, let alone go out and take on the agricultural budget, one of the biggest budgets in Europe, and he's the one in charge. It really is unbelievable, but the question behind all of that is who decided that he would go out and represent us? There was no election, no discussion, no debate. Even within the national parliament there was no debate and no discussion and no selection process. They were appointed. And the countries, the key powerful countries in Europe divvy those portfolios out. And this time, for the first time, you've got this kind of almost like a two-tier commission, because of course we didn't agree with the getting rid of the commission in the last referendum. So as some sort of sop to us, they altered that. But at the end of the day, you have more or less the same thing. Now, as I said, the commission is appointed, and yet it's the most powerful body. It's the only body can initiate legislation. They are rulers and our masters from now on for the next 5 years. And they have been appointed from above. So is that not some sort of central imperialist diktat from above? I don't see it as anything else other than that. And the fact that some of the key positions have been given out in Europe, the citizens in those countries don't even want, as in Ireland, but in some of the other countries, the citizens in those countries don't even want those people there. They didn't even want them in their own countries in a position of power. So they were moved out of their own countries to Europe, where they could actually, have more power to decide our future. Then you look at the European Court of Justice. And the European Court of Justice, well, courts, I suppose, can't be elected. But the European Court of Justice is one of the most powerful institutions in the EU because it decides what the policies are. We voted on the Lisbon Treaty. So we could have voted on what we thought this is what it meant. But the ECJ will decide what it really means. And this happened, we could see it with the case of Pringle, when Thomas Pringle courageously went to the European Court to challenge the European Stability Mechanism Treaty. We were told that, well, what the treaty really says isn't what it means. And that was by the highest court in the EU. It's higher than our own Supreme Court. It's higher than any Supreme Court in any member state, including Germany, whether they like it or not. And this is the court that decides that what the treaty is, what we say it means, regardless of what everybody else thinks it means. And there is no way to challenge that. And in fact, where there was, many years ago, there was an ECJ decision about what the treaty actually meant. And in the Maastricht Treaty, the member states tried to get a protocol attached which would kind of weaken the effect of that judgment. The court came back afterwards and says, yeah, well, this protocol actually means it has to be in line with our previous judgment. In other words, you can't change the treaties if we don't agree with what your interpretation of them is. So the EU is an empire where the real control lies with both the court, the Commission and the Council. None of these are accountable. And the citizens of all the member states are subject to the laws that are decided at that level, whether we like it or not, and we have absolutely no say on changing who makes those and decides those laws. So we're living in a so-called democracy which has been presented to us that the EU is a democracy, but it's far, far from it. And would you be better where, it's called an empire and it is an empire? As Barroso, I think it was Prodi said, you can call it what you like. That was but the European army. But at the end of the day, that's what it is. So with the EU, you can call it what you like. But at the end of the day, it's quite clear that it is far from a democracy. I just wanted to touch on two other things because I think I'm probably coming to the end of my time. And one is in relation to the European Union's policies on imperialistic policies in relation to resources. We could see, like in relation to negotiations and trade agreements, the trade agreements are to benefit the EU. And let's not be mistaken about that. There is no way the EU negotiates trade agreements that are going to be beneficial to poor and peripheral countries around the world. It just doesn't make sense. When it comes to EU policy itself, all policy and all strategy within the European Union is geared towards ensuring that any access it has to global resources, it wants to maintain those accesses. It wants to keep that access as free as possible and also as cheap and easy as possible. And at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter if other people outside of the European Union suffer. And that's an imperialistic attitude. If you think that you are more important than those countries out there on the periphery of the world, then you're an imperialist. It's an imperialist attitude. And I want to just finally finish on what John talked about, because for me again, what beggars belief is this idea that somehow you can have a referendum on independence, and as soon as you get your independence, from what you think is a centralised power that imposes decisions and policies on you. And as soon as you get that independence, you hand it over to another entity that is even less accountable and even further removed and even larger. And that's exactly what Scotland plans to do. And the idea that somehow something further away, more powerful and less accountable is going to solve your problems is just hard to grasp. And a lot of people in Ireland think the idea of, independence, Scottish independence, and somehow it's independence from the British Empire, and we can sort of relate to that because of our own history. But nobody seems to, or most people fail to see the irony in a situation of where, if, for example, when Ireland got its independence, what happened? Not long after it, we handed it over. So the idea of fighting for independence or trying to struggle to gain independence and then handing over that independence to something that has absolutely no accountability, it's just hard to understand. And I know that there are people who might think that, if Scotland gets its independence, that could be useful, because it's going to trigger independent regimes in other parts of Europe, like, for example, in Catalan or
Wales.
Wales, Basque Country, wherever, all these different regions. It all depends on what they mean by independence, because if it's only independence within an empire, it's not really independence. If Wales gets its independence but remains within the European Union, with the EU deciding everything for it, if Northern Ireland gets independence, remains within the EU, letting the EU decide everything for it, and as John has just pointed out, enshrining every single word of the Lisbon Treaty, or the EU treaties, into their constitution, then they have joined an empire, an imperialistic project. So they have moved from one empire into another. Having said that, I mean, if Scotland says yes or no, they're still in an empire, so it doesn't really make much difference on that score. But I'll just finish with that, and thank you very much.
I think this was a really terrific session. I think we've had a really, really good discussion, and I agree very much with Richard and everybody that we need to get these issues out into the public. We need far more people involved in them. But and just for now, we must think of ways of doing that. But for now, I just want to really thank all three of our panellists. They all made wonderful contributions, and I think we got some really thoughtful and wonderful contributions from the floor too. So thank you, everybody, and give yourselves a round of applause.